Okay, first of all, I just want to take an opportunity to say thanks for taking a few minutes of your time today. I know you're going to get out of school for this for a little bit, so that's okay. But we're sitting here in Pierce, South Dakota, and I think there's a lot of folks out there that are curious about what your thoughts are with regard to net neutrality and about what you're hearing about it and the way that you use the internet and what you would see or perceive as being the critical issues that we should be concerned about when we start making appropriate laws governing the internet. So can I just start out, Paul, let's just start with you and let's just work our way through it, and we'll try to let you do more talking than me. And this is as much a learning session for me as anything. And if there's some questions I can't answer, I'll try to, but let's just go ahead and we'll kind of have a conversation.
All right, well, one question I've thought about is, without net neutrality, I've heard that it's going to be like an unfair advantage for smaller businesses against like bigger businesses like Amazon and Google. I just wanted to know what your thoughts are on that.
Actually, we think that under what had been put together under what I think a lot of people call the net neutrality law, but what had been put in back in 2015 by the FCC would actually do the opposite, because what would have happened is it would have started to govern and regulate the internet activity of internet service providers, similar to the way the old Ma Bell used to be. Do you remember the stories about when you used to have, maybe you've even seen them, the old phones that had the rotary dials on them when you'd pick it up, but then you'd dial each number, 224, okay? That was under Ma Bell, the old Northwestern Bell system. There was no competition. And what we think is the way that the internet exploded was when we had a very light touch by the FCC and the Federal Trade Commission and allowed the internet to grow and expand. We think there's a lot of startups out there that would like to be able to get in, just like some of the big providers have already had the opportunity to do. We think that this new approach that would have put this under the same guidelines of the old 1934 law would have restricted that. And that's one of the reasons why most of us felt it was the wrong direction to go. We wanted to have more open competition and literally to allow some of those smaller ones to be able to compete with the big ones. And I think Republicans and Democrats all agree on that one in Washington, D.C. It's just a matter of how we get it done.
So I think the way that we're seeing it is as the repeal of net neutrality is against consumers in general, and it's like you just addressed, there's more benefit for big business, and it's not going to be beneficial for us at all. Can you kind of address that?
Sure. What we're thinking is that, see, when the internet really developed, it was what they call a light touch on the regulation. And for years, the internet exploded. In fact, we had development. In order to get good internet connectivity, you've got to actually have infrastructure being put in. Infrastructure can mean a lot of things to a lot of places. It can mean water development, it can mean roads and bridges. But in this particular case, we're talking about fiber optic lines moving across the country that carry not just voice, but they carry data as well, which is what makes up the internet. And with that, you get to certain locations where you then go wireless. Well, that infrastructure development costs a lot of money, and in order to get that in, the more of that you put in, the more data you can move, the faster you can move it, and so forth. So when we start talking about how fast you can move the data and how much data can be moved and the capacities and so forth, you've got to be able to continue to improve the infrastructure that actually handles it. The fear that we had was that while it was growing at a very rapid rate before the 2015 imposition of the 1934 law by the FCC, before that, we had the internet infrastructure growing at a rapid rate. As a matter of fact, it grew every year except during the times of a recession until 2015, when the FCC order that we call the net neutrality order became effective. And then for a period of 2 years, from 2015 to 2017, we actually saw infrastructure development not increase and not stop, but actually be reduced. And we feel very strongly that that was caused by the FCC's heavy-handedness in saying, we're going to regulate you like we would Ma Bell from back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's when a judge took that argument apart and opened it up so that all these new providers, the Verizons, the Sprints, and so forth, could compete against Ma Bell. That's when we started seeing telecommunications explode. We're afraid that if we left it in place, that it would actually stop the new startup companies from coming in and taking advantage of those infrastructure opportunities.
So you're saying it's more or less restricting to advancement?
The evidence is pretty clear that from the time that the law went into effect, or the rule went into effect, until the time that it was taken out, infrastructure designed for expansion of internet services actually went down. That's not what we need, particularly in rural areas. We need more internet. Matter of fact, one of the biggest concerns I've got is internet connectivity in the rural areas. We need the same speeds, we need the same capacity as in the urban areas. And yet in some cases, some of the FCC's own desires in the past in terms of acceptable broadband has been to say that urban areas should be faster than rural areas. I disagree with that approach. So yeah, I think we're better off. Everybody wants to make sure that companies, the internet service providers, don't come out and try to stop free speech, as an example, or try to say you can only use the company for getting some of your material, some of your applications from our affiliated organization. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen, but in order to do that, these folks need to know that there'd be competition out there and that other people would come in and compete against them. We think we can do that better under the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, but I think Republicans and Democrats alike agree that we don't want to see internet service providers restricting your ability without having competition from somebody that says that's a bad business model, you're not going to be in business very long. And so that's kind of the difference between the two. The FCC says we're going to regulate it and say nobody can make changes. You're going to have to follow a regulatory process. And I think Chairman Pai with the FCC today is suggesting, wait a minute, we want innovation, we want people to invest, we want people to come up with new ideas. Some may be economy packages saying, okay, if all you're looking for is communications capabilities to Facebook or to do Twitter and so forth, versus others who want to download large packages on Netflix. And so you might very well have a big package at home, but on your phone you might not want to have the same package because you don't want to pay as much money. That innovation is something we don't want to lose. I think that's one thing that Republicans and Democrats both agree on. The issue for us is how do we go about making it work? And that's where we're having our disagreement, is the tactic to get it done. What else?
So I think what some people are afraid of is that, like you said, that you can have to pay for certain options. Like on your phone, you wouldn't have maybe as much things. People are afraid that they've used to having it free. They just pay for the internet and they can go to whatever sites they choose. They're afraid that now I'm gonna have to pay extra for certain sites that I want to go to, instead of and maybe I still have to go to all these sites, but I have to pay extra money for even ones that I don't use as much.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I think it's even a greater concern, granted we're seniors and we're going into college, and we already have excessive amounts of fees and things like that, and it's just one extra thing that we're concerned about paying for. So that's probably one of my greatest concerns.
Are they going to charge added fees to access certain things, or if I want certain numbers?
Whichever provider you have, the way it's presented to us is we're seeing it's extra money we're going to have to pay out when we're already buying our laptops, and now we have to pay our service providers.
Similar to how a cable bill is. Maybe you want to get these extra channels, but it's also going to cost extra money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that's a fair point. But the competition, and here's what our thought process on it is. I think that's a fear that a lot of folks have got out there. But if you've got competition and not just one or two providers, they're going to look for the best business model that brings you in the door. It's kind of like the telephone companies today. I mean, if you take a look at the different providers today for your phone service, you go down and you look to see which one's got the best package for you. Under the 1934 Act with Ma Bell, we couldn't do that because we only had one, and there was no competition out there. Since that time, with the broadband and the expansion of broadband, there's been some people that have really developed and had major successes out there. But they did it under kind of a very relaxed series of internet laws, because if somebody came in and said, guess what, my package of $49 a month is the best thing out there, and you said, that's a lot of money to spend for a kid that's going to college, somebody else comes back in and says, 99 unlimited data. Which one do you take? Well, that's still available under the relaxed program. But what we have seen is that under the FCC's guidelines, there was a real concern about whether or not, and some companies actually said, we're not sure we can offer discounted or value-added packages under the FCC's guidelines because we have to treat everybody equally. Well, what about somebody that doesn't want the full gambit of all of the package? What about if you're at college and you're saying, wait a second, I want the most inexpensive one that gets me my data, but my friend's got one where we're going to be able to download, and we want to be able to download Netflix on a regular basis. And so you pay two different package amounts. Is it fair to say that I can pick and choose, and is that fair? And I think that's maybe where the differences are sometimes, is some of us look at that and say, I want as many different options as I can possibly get. And then there's other folks that say, wait a minute, I just want to make darn sure that whatever I get, it's free. But is anything ever really free? But I think you bring up a really good point, because even though we say it's free, there's still a package that you've bought, but then everything's included in the package, right?
Yeah.
But you're still paying a fee.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but within the fee, you're now able to access a whole lot of different apps, right, or packages. But if you go to college and you say, I'm going to buy everything, I want unlimited stuff, do you think you'd still have that available to you in college today, but you'd have to pay a fee to do it one time, just like you would at home? I mean, does that make sense, or am I missing something?
No,
I think it makes
Okay.
sense.
I got it.
So what we're really concerned about is how we go about getting the message out that says we want a net neutral approach in that everybody has a fair shot at the internet. But we also want to see innovation where everybody has a chance to offer their products without having an internet service provider be able to stop you from looking at all those different options. Well, if you've only got one ISP, in an area, you don't have a whole lot of competition. I don't think that's right. So what you really want is competition so that you've got multiple ISPs, and they're looking at each other to find out which group's got the best possible package. That's what we're thinking about, but I'm not sure if that's the way that it's portrayed when you see the stuff on the internet or when you read the stuff. Can you share with me a little bit about some of the other concerns that you've seen?
Not looking from a consumer's perspective, but looking at the business side, I think it's already pretty prevalent that ISPs are kind of monopolistic when you're looking at Verizon, AT&T, and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so my question would probably be is it encouraging for those smaller businesses to compete with bigger businesses like Verizon, things like that?
Yeah, fair question. And what we're hoping is that based upon when the internet actually grew and where the biggest ones got to be the biggest ones was under the very light touch approach, where everybody could compete and where new ones could develop and provide challenges. We think that a lot of the smaller ones have a more difficult time if they have a heavy regulatory burden to comply with to begin with. Mm-hmm. That's a concern to us. The evidence is pretty clear that the biggest apps out there, the biggest programs out there, actually developed when the internet was not impacted by the FCC ruling in 2015. Google, Facebook, Twitter. When you look down the line at the ones that are the big ones today, they were the most successful and they grew the fastest during a time in which the FCC was not taking a heavy-handed approach to regulating them. Well, I want to see more competition for them, and I want to see more competition in the ISP market as well. I don't want to lock anybody in saying, now you're a regulated industry, you're protected, or as long as you follow the rules, you've got an inside edge. I want to see more competition out there, like we saw before you were ever born, when Ma Bell was broken up. The Bell Telephone Company was broken up, and they said we were going to have competition. Suddenly, then you had all these little startups, and they were little startups to begin with. Sprint was a little startup. Now look at it today. So you look at all those different things that occurred once we said Competition is going to drive it. Consumers will find the right spot. What we don't want is to have anybody out there saying there's nobody that's protecting us as consumers against unfair trade acts. And the cop on the beat on unfair trade acts for years has been the Federal Trade Commission. What we disagreed with on the FCC order in 2015 was that authority was moved from the FTC to the FCC. And in doing so, it took the best cop, we thought, off the beat, and it put the FCC, who had fewer tools, on the beat. The FTC can actually go back in, even today, and not only stop deceptive trade practices and so forth, but they can also order rebates to people who got hurt, which we think is a pretty important deal. So I think Republicans and Democrats both want the same thing. It's a matter of what's better, the regulatory approach under the 1934 law, where they're identified as Title II communications providers, or under a more wide open, let's get the best competitors out there, let the market decide, and when you get a chance to buy a really, really inexpensive product on a monthly fee versus maybe one that's got a whole bunch of bells and whistles on it, you get to make that choice. And at the same time, if you want to be able to download a whole bunch of stuff and set it up in one, and you watch a lot of movies and so forth, versus maybe mom or dad who would much prefer to be able to have communications, they can start buying which one they want without worrying about having to buy everything else under a regulated thing where everybody has to be treated exactly the same. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to
Okay.
me.
What else is out there?
So I know that internet providers are pushing, saying, oh, we want net neutrality too, and like the average person, they want net neutrality. Who is pushing against it and for more regulations?
Well, I think that's kind of the part of the question that's out there is who's pushing for net neutrality, because everybody really believes in a fair and open plan where there's not a built-in advantage for one provider versus another provider. And I think some people believe that the FCC's order, the one that was put in 2015, provided that. Then there's other folks like me who think that really restricted it and said it gave an advantage to people that were already in the business. And so if we really want to talk about what's the best approach, I'd rather go into a store where I can choose from 5 or 6 or 7 different products as opposed to 1 or 2 products. With the FCC, they were coming in saying, we're going to regulate you guys like monopolies. We're going to regulate you like we did in 1934 under Title II of the Communications Act. Well, that's an archaic law. And we didn't think that the internet providers should have that built-in edge of being locked in as monopolies. But we also thought, based on our history, that the way that the internet and the activity on the internet and the innovations that occurred before this law was put in effect. And then as we watched it for that period of 2 years, literally slow down the investment, that told us there was something wrong, clearly something wrong. And so we repealed the ability of the FCC, but that didn't mean we wanted unfair playing fields and that we didn't want a cop on the beat. We just wanted the Federal Trade Commission to be a part of that discussion. But under the 2015 law, the FTC was cut out of it, and it was directed over to the FCC. We think that's the wrong approach for internet. So what we're hoping is that by opening up the internet once again and getting more investment in the internet once again, that you're going to have more choices. And in doing so, you're going to be able to decide if you want a package that's got lots of bells and whistles on it, or if you're going to want a package that has less but costs you less money. And if you keep it open, those internet service providers are going to be looking at whether they're making the right choices as far as the packages that you're offering you. If they're restricted and saying, I have to offer exactly the same thing to everybody, I think you're the ones that suffer, because you're the ones that get one size fits all. And let's take a look at what actually has worked in the past, and that is to be innovative and to start literally having the ability to design the package that you as a consumer want, and to be able to have somebody who can sell it to you, and not have that ISP be subject to a law that says I have to provide the same levels of service to everybody. I'd rather see them competing with the best package, so when you make those choices in competition, you get lots of options and you choose what's best for you. And we just truly believe that we're better off not having the FCC make those regulatory moves. And I think our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, the Democrats, I think they want the same thing. We just have a different philosophy about how to get there. Yeah.
I think going along regulation-wise, if one thing I'm not understanding is if you completely take away net neutrality, take away all that regulation, what replaces that? Because what it sounds like is just free game, nobody has any control, and what we see is, well, who's going to stop big business from taking advantage of everybody else? So what kind of, would there be any regulation whatsoever, or what's the plan for that?
I think that's a...
Could I add to that?
Yeah.
Just like, I think one of the biggest fears is censorship in general. Like,
okay.
Just like a smaller business isn't going to have as equal of an advantage as like a bigger business, like as Google or Amazon or something like that.
Yeah. Well, do you mean like in terms of free speech, in terms of...
Well, yeah, but just like I've seen, like, say I own a business that's similar to Amazon, but it's not like the exact same.
Mm-hmm.
And like Amazon obviously has more power than I do because they're a bigger business.
More money.
Yeah, more money to like get my business out there more over Amazon would be more difficult for a guy like me starting a business.
Mm-hmm.
So do you kind of get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think so. Kind of like, can the big guys kind of overshadow the guys that don't have enough money?
Yeah.
I think that's probably maybe the biggest difference of opinion in terms of how to address it between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans, for the most part, have said the FCC is the wrong place to go to actually provide that regulation, because if you regulate it, we don't think we're going to see the new guys coming in to start up, because in a regulated environment, you really don't have a lot of startup companies. It's in that wild and open, kind of the Wild West, where people can come in and the regs are less overwhelming, that you get that small guy to be able to come in and start up. We talked to one service provider, it's just a rural service provider. Their costs to comply with the regulatory environment that was being imposed on them by the FCC was about $150,000 a year. That's $150,000 that they couldn't put into building out infrastructure in their service area. So I think part of what you're interested in, though, is if I'm a business and I want to use the internet to get it out, and I know that the big folks are in there, what stops the big guys from unfairly stopping me from competing with them? Is that a fair way to say it? Okay. Let's just take an example. The big guys got big when they were competing with one another when there was no net neutrality law in effect by the FCC. So the fair playing field they had is we're going to go at each other and the consumer is going to decide which one works the best, right? Now we're getting to the point where you've got smaller folks that want to come in and do the same thing and provide a new avenue. But what you're worried about is a deceptive trade practice on the part of the big guys to stop competition. The best cop we've got on the beat that's been doing it for years is the Federal Trade Commission to stop those unfair trade practices. The 2015 law, or the 2015 directive that basically moved the responsibility for this over to the FCC, took it away from the Federal Trade Commission, who normally does that for the rest of the business environment in the United States today. So by removing the FTC, we lost the cop on the beat for deceptive and unfair trade practices. But even more than that, I think there's perhaps a misperception that somehow folks in Washington were trying to allow the big guys to have an unfair trade advantage. And I think Republicans, Democrats alike, don't want that. They want that free and open process. It's just a matter that I think some Dems really felt that the FCC could regulate that, whereas Republicans felt that it was more appropriate to have Congress lay out and create a law, but to use the Federal Trade Commission to do so. And I think that's where a lot of the disagreement has been in terms of who actually should be doing the regulation of exactly what you have a concern with. And it almost gets down to being nitpicky about it in a way, Federal Trade Commission versus FCC. And yet the evidence is based on the law that was put in effect, we've slowed down infrastructure development since that 2015 law was put in effect. And we know that the internet succeeded in growing when it was a light touch under the Federal Trade Commission. So hopefully, as we get back into this and you watch the Federal Trade Commission, there is clear evidence that in over 500 cases, they have actually fined or ordered rebates back to companies that have unfairly or used deceptive trade practices against other competitors. So we've got the tools. It's a matter of whether or not we're properly using them. And so it will not be the case of where there's nobody in charge. But we do think it's more appropriate that the Federal Trade Commission do it rather than the FCC. But once again, Republicans, Democrats alike, we agree there needs to be somebody who establishes the fair playing field. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, good question.
What's the status right now on net neutrality in Congress? I thought I saw there's a vote coming up. What's the issue with that?
There are certain motions that are called privileged motions, and a congressional resolution of disapproval is an act that hasn't been used until like the last year since President Trump came in, but it had been in effect where what it says is that it provides for an expedited law that could stop a rule from going into effect, a federal rule. And what it says is that Congress has the ability to overrule a federal agency in the rulemaking process. So since Chairman Pai and the FCC have made a rule that disbands the Obama-era 2015 net neutrality guidelines rule, that's a new rule. And when that comes into effect, Congress has the ability to challenge that within a certain length of time. That is being challenged by the minority party. But they can, with the help of some Republicans, they can do this not with a 60-vote margin in the Senate, but with a 50-vote margin. So it's what they call a privileged motion that goes to the floor upon demand. And if it comes up to the 50 votes, the majority vote, then it passes and it moves on to the other house, which is also a majority vote. So a congressional resolution of disapproval in this case would stop the new FCC rule that takes out the old 2015 FCC net neutrality rule. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the new rule that basically opens it up again and says the Federal Trade Commission is back in doing the monitoring and so forth and is an active partner again, that's what's being challenged in the Senate today. Now, if it was to pass the Senate, and it might pass the Senate, because there are some Republicans along with Democrats who think it's better to just not fight the battle, let the FCC have it and not worry about it. Yeah, see where it goes. But it would also have to pass the House. If it were to pass the House with a majority vote, then the president would have to sign it into law. Now, the president can veto it. If the president vetoes it, then it takes a 2/3 vote of each House to override the veto, which is unlikely. So in the meantime, I think Senator Thune is chairman of the Commerce Committee. Senator Thune has made it very clear, look, we want to do this right. Let's do it with modern regulations, with modern laws. Let's have a light touch on the internet and allow infrastructure to be developed. Bring new companies in to allow them easier access into the market to compete with the big guys and not lock in any guaranteed protections for the big guys that are out there. And what he's suggesting is this should be a bipartisan effort. So I think once we get past this CRA and get back into it, I think the Commerce Committee is probably the right place to address it, take a look at it, find reasonable but very light touch regulations to continue to allow the internet to grow. In rural areas, we're not there yet. We need more broadband, and we need more infrastructure. We need more investment. We can't afford to have folks saying, there's other places to make money. This is going to be a regulated industry. They'll get their rate of return on it, but getting in and getting out, those guys already got an advantage on me because they're already big and they're already in it. We want cowboys. We want other folks coming in saying, I got a better idea. And we want to make the ability to access the internet with their provisions as easy as possible, which means as lightly regulated as possible. What else?
So what's the average congressman's opinion or congresswoman's opinion on net neutrality? Are there some leaning mostly towards an open free internet or a more regulated internet?
I think everybody, Republicans and Democrats alike, want an open and free internet. But I think we all have differing opinions about how we get there. I think our Democrat colleagues think that by going to the FCC, they're saying, okay, we're going to make this a level playing field out there so that everybody can say, I can get on the field and play. Republicans look at it and say, wait a second, take a look at what's happened. We need more build out. We need more investment. And clearly, companies are afraid to invest in this regulated environment. This isn't the right way to go. But we all want a growing internet, and we all want more broadband investment. We've got a real honest disagreement about the best way to do it. But in terms of free and growing internet and access to internet and ideas coming out, I think Republicans and Democrats all want the same thing. We're just kind of talking past one another. And in the middle of it, there are outside forces that are having a lot of fun influencing people and playing games. Outside forces who think they get an advantage one way or the other. We've got cases where we've got the usual trolls that are out there that in some cases will send 90,000 requests or demands or opinions from one site. We've got the Russians involved in it, actually creating almost like a fake news environment in some cases, where we know that a lot of the opinions that are expressed on this come out of and away from Russian sites, where they pretend to be American citizens giving different opinions. So the game is out there, and the manipulation does go on. That's one of the reasons why the nice thing here is let Congress get into the middle of this thing and actually look at what the facts are, gather as many of the facts as possible, and get down into not just seeing what folks are thinking about out there, but seeing what's swaying their opinions and why it's being swayed, seeing what those forces are and who's taking advantage of the situation to either protect their current interests or who really think that that there's a problem someplace that needs to be solved. Hey, look, I thank you. I know this is it's an interesting subject, and I think you've done a very nice job of working your way through it. This is what we need more of, is to have a civil discussion about it where we can actually do a give and take and talk about the concerns we've got, but also find that common ground. Because when we move forward on this thing here, everybody wants the internet to grow and to thrive. And we also want to make sure that it's available to everybody in the country. The only way we're going to have businesses grow in rural areas is to have as much infrastructure as possible. And that's one of the things that I care deeply about coming from a rural state. So thank you very, very much for taking time with me to kind of work our way through it.
Thank you for making time to
Yeah,
having us.
Let's do it again sometime.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks.